Today I'm going to be building a new leaf spring for one of my vices. I don't know if this spring is original, but it doesn't work very well and I think it looks terrible. So I'm going to build a proper leaf spring to match the vise that I have on the other side of this vise stand. The first step in removing the old leaf spring is to take the pressure off the front jaw by totally removing the screw box mechanism. You need to be careful as you're removing the actual screw because on some vices the vise jaw will actually swing right down to the ground. This one doesn't move very much, so I got lucky here. Next you need to loosen the bracket that clamps the rear leg of the vise to the mounting bracket. On this vise it's just a simple U-bolt, but on some vices there is a U-shaped shackle that's held in place with a couple of wedges. You don't need to remove the bracket totally because this is the only thing that's holding the vise upright right now, so you just need to loosen it enough to get the spring out. The longest part of this process is actually cutting the material that you need out of a car leaf spring. I only have a cutoff wheel and an angle grinder to do this, so it took about 20 minutes and a couple of discs. I always cut the stock that I need out of the center of the leaf spring rather than just trimming one edge because that gives me two clean edges that don't have any pits or nicks or marks of any kind. So that leaves me with a fairly good strong spring. If I left the original outside edge, there might be some cracks or pitting that I really don't know about, and that could cause the spring to fail. This spring doesn't flex very much, and I don't even bother heat treating it, but I still don't want to spend all this time making a spring and then build in problems that I'm going to have to deal with later. So this is the piece I was after. It tapers from roughly 1.5 inches at the top down to 1 inch at the bottom, and you'll just have to measure this to fit whatever vise you're working with. The first step in forging the spring is to create the ears that wrap around the front leg of the vise. Here I'm creating an offset at the lower end of the spring that's about 1/2 inch away from the end of the bar. The material left by the offset gives me the material that I need to forge the ears of the spring, and the transition between the offset and the main portion of the bar allows me to forge a slight taper to the lower end of the spring. I'm barely reducing the thickness of the spring at all at this point. It's just enough of a taper to allow the spring to bend gracefully and not point load any one portion of the spring. To draw out the material for the ears, I start by cross-peening the very edge of the spring into a fishtail shape. You can see how I'm holding the cross-peen at an angle to create a very steep bevel on the end of the bar. I don't want to reduce the thickness of the spring anywhere else but at the very bottom edge of that spring. Now I'm going to be further refining the shape of the ears by hammering down the edges that sit outside the main body of the spring. The last thing that needs to be done is to put a slight outward curve to this section of the spring. That way the leading edge of the spring doesn't have a tendency to scrape up against the front leg of the vise. It has a well-rounded surface to run on. The top section of the spring needs to remain perfectly flat because it rests up against the back leg of the vise. Here I'm just estimating where that flat section is going to be. Now that I have the spring back in the vise, I see that I need to lower the position of that straight section down by about 1.5 inches. Here I've made that adjustment and I'm using a piece of chalk to mark the top edge of the shackle. Now I can cut the spring to its final length, which is going to be about 3/4 inch above this mark. And the very last step is just to forge a simple right angle bend at the top of the spring. And then once everything looks right, I'll be ready to put the spring back in the vise. For the vise to work properly, the spring needs to apply tension to the front leg of the vise through its entire range of motion. So I need to adjust the spring so that it starts making contact with the front leg of the vise when it's sitting out at about a 45-degree angle the way you see it here. That way when I assemble the screw, the front leg is already under tension and it holds the vise screw in its proper position when I'm opening and closing the vise. You don't want a spring that's so loose that the screw starts to flop around when the vise is opened about 3 or 4 inches.